Right, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. My name is George. I'm the founder of Not Quite Unicorns. As you should all know, hopefully you know what you're here for. We're going to be talking about security in bubble apps. Not so much general security advice, but specific stuff that you can focus on that you might not have even considered when you're building apps professionally. So a little bit about kind of the background. I run a small agency. We launched properly, I would say, about this time last year. We're a team of senior bubble developers. We have 3 developers, including myself, and we also have a designer. We do things a little bit differently from other agencies, which is why we've kind of just taken the approach of just working with senior devs. We think it allows us to kind of deliver a better quality. But yeah, we basically do app audits. We do them for $1. So if you're looking to get an app audit, certainly go for it. It's very low risk. And during that, we essentially go through every app's workload usage, performance, user experience, and also security. So that's our background. We've also posted a lot of educational resources with various security topics on the Bubble, which you can check out after this if you want. If you hear me clicking around, I'm just admitting extra people into the meeting. And if you cannot hear me, just spam the chat. Or if you want me to slow down, go back on anything, spam the chat. But we will be opening up for questions at the end, or if you want to just send questions in chat, then that's absolutely fine. I'll probably save them all to the end because maybe I'll answer them. And if there are any questions that I'm not able to answer, then I can get back to you and find out the answers for you. So the plan. We did an audit of about 18,000 apps. And if you're a professional bubble developer, there's a good chance we audited your own app. So what we did is we looked at one simple security metric, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Then we're going to talk about how professionals should treat security. So that's our responsibilities as kind of professional developers to ensure that everything that we produce is secure, and how that differs between Bubble's responsibility to keep the platform secure, for example. We're going to look at what Bubble makes public about your app. This is the stuff that you can't control, so you just need to be aware of it to reduce the risk of your app being exploited. And with that, hopefully we don't have any of the official Bubble team here. We're going to explore, poke around Bubble's official app and see what we can find out about it, just to illustrate kind of why it's important, and things to consider when you're building your app so that you make sure that anything that is public is absolutely fine to be public. We're going to then look at a backend security issue. This is one of the most common issues that we find in apps that we audit, where it essentially allows any logged in user to access any backend workflow. So we'll look at that, how you can mitigate it, and other things that you might find useful. And we'll try and link these to be actionable tips. So rather than kind of generic security advice, these are things that you can implement pretty easily to make sure that your app's pretty secure. So is everyone hearing everything okay? Just send a message like, yeah, no. Yep, fantastic. Okay. Great. Let's continue. And I assume you can see my screen as well. I'll be switching it later, but yeah. So we audited 18,000 bubble apps. We got these from a variety of sources, but we excluded apps that weren't live, that weren't on a custom domain, and weren't on a paid plan, as well as templates. So in theory, this data set is apps that are live bubble apps that are being used by real people. And as such, they need to have security. It's pretty essential. Let's just let someone else in. So we focused on one key metric, and that's editor rights. So in your bubble editor, in the general settings, you'll know that you're able to set the permissions of your app. So that can be either private, which it probably should be. It can be read-only, so I think it's view as, and then it can also be view and editable. So it kind of gets progressively worse, but we decided just to keep it simple and focus on this one key security metric. And initially, before I kind of launched the study, I was like, maybe there'll be a few apps that have this issue. Turns out that's not true. So 11.2% of all of live bubble apps have public editors. So when your editor is public, that means you allow anyone to view it. They're allowed full data access to both their development and their live environment. Any user can run as any user, including admin users. It allows viewing of any API keys, basically anything that's in your bubble editor that could be exploited. That's particularly bad if you're using things like Stripe, because with your Stripe API key, they can do anything. Even worse if you're running a marketplace app, for example, because if you're running a software as a service app, the damage is limited essentially to your own income. But if you're running a marketplace using things like Stripe Express, then if they have the Stripe API key, they may be able to initiate payouts to people that they shouldn't and things like that. The other thing that we found, which was kind of surprising, is that professionals actually perform worse. So you can see here the proportion of apps that were public based on who built the apps. So apps are either built by an agency or they're not built by an agency. That's as measured by Bubble. You're able to find out if an app was built by an agency. Bubble makes that public. But essentially, we're able to break down the agencies, apps built by agencies, into their agency tiers. So we can actually see some useful data and see how the agency tier affects the likelihood of this issue occurring. So what you'll notice is that gold agencies perform significantly better than silver and bronze agencies. Still, it's 9%. 9% of their apps that they produce have public editors where anyone can run as any user. All data is public, so it's still not great. But it's an improvement on silver and bronze. But the interesting thing is that if you take all of the agency stats, so gold, silver, bronze, and if you include no-tiered agencies, they're still more likely to have this issue than apps that are not built by agencies at all. So then we were able to essentially rank each agency based on the proportion of their apps that are public. This graph here only includes agencies with more than 5 apps, so it will tend to be biased towards gold, silver, bronze, because no-tier agencies are less likely to have more than 5 apps that we audited. The reason for that is we didn't want if we audited one app for an agency, we didn't want that to skew the data. If it says 100% of their apps are public, obviously if we've only audited one, it's probably not a large enough sample size to make a fair judgment. But this one, the top gold agency by number of editors that are public, has 66% of their editors are public. We audited 6 of their apps and 4 were entirely public. So we kind of need to look at why does this happen. I kind of come up with 2 reasons. The first is agencies tend to use it to bypass the agency plan to save costs. So instead of paying for an agency seat where you can add unlimited agency seat members to a Bubble app, essentially what I think that they've been doing is just making the editor public and allowing people to edit that way. The other reason I think for it, and I think this is probably making up a larger chunk, is I think that within agencies, people are likely to make their app public temporarily to get support from their agency. So you can imagine in a large agency with a lot of developers, if you want help from a senior developer, instead of adding them as a collaborator, you might just make the editor public only for a little bit and then send that link to them. The problem with that is it's very easy to forget and essentially never get made private again. So with that aside, there's a lot more that's public in your Bubble app, and this is stuff that you can't control. So we'll just go through it. I also have a forum post about this, which has everything that I'm about to tell you written down, which you may want to explore after this. Maybe someone will send the link into the chat. But there's a few things that are public. So the first of those is your app meta. I'm going to share my own screen. Let's see. Great, fantastic. So I'm going to load up Bubble's meta. Now, what is the meta, you ask? It's a specific URL on every single Bubble app. Essentially, it gives an overview of every data type that is enabled in the data API and every public backend workflow. So for instance, this is Bubble's official API meta. I can see that they have an endpoint, which is called add uploaded file. And with kind of the app name, the S3 key, the size, we're able to upload a file. It also tells you whether you need authentication for these. So if I search up apps where we need authentication or don't need authentication, I can essentially go through all of the endpoints that might be open to exploitation. Now, that might not be particularly relevant because, as I'll explain to you later, they might be doing authentication within the backend workflow itself. But things like this, so this is a certification users exists. If you give it an email, it will probably return you the kind of unique ID of the certification. And we can tell this just from the information that they're giving us. The next thing is database structure. So if you load up any Bubble app, this is Bubble's official app, you can type console.log app. And this is very interesting because you can essentially do anything. If we explore this information over here, what this is a list of pretty much all of the information that you could want about a Bubble app. So the first of those is the data types. These are all of Bubble's official data types. It may be a bit small. I apologize for that, but I'll read them out to you, anything that's particularly interesting. But we can see, for example, they have a data type called announcement banner, app idea, app user tag, as well as bootcamp tickets, bootcamp sessions, and Bubble employees, which they probably use to display on their marketing pages. Now, we're not just limited to the data types themselves, we can also view the fields associated with it. So for example, on the Bubble employee data type, there's an assigned users number field, which is obviously the number of users that have been assigned to them. There's a bio field, a name field, all of the other fields that you might expect. The problem becomes when you kind of rely on people just not finding out how your Bubble app works to do security. We call that obfuscation, where essentially you're trying to make it difficult to work out how an app works. That's what you need to avoid, because Bubble, more than any other platform, makes it really public how your app works. So it's important that you build it securely. The next thing that it makes public is option sets. This is pretty well known. Any option set that you make is public. So for example, they have an app pricing option set. They have an overage rate, price, workload tier. That's a Boolean field, whether it includes workload units, whether it's a yearly plan. And then we can see all of the values for these as well for each option. So it's just something to consider if you are, for example, implementing a word-based authentication where you send people 3 words that they need to type in it's kind of a 2-factor authentication thing rather than numbers. If you stored the possible words in an option set, then people could see all of the words that it could be and just trial and error, brute force them, which would obviously not be good. So anything that should not be shown to the user should be in the backend using a data type, and you can make that private using privacy rules. The other thing is API connector calls. So the URLs that you're making calls to, and part of the body information is also public. So it's important that when you are using API keys, you make those private. All of your pages are also public. I was surprised that this isn't as well known. I thought it would be more well known, but you're probably aware already that you can specify which pages are added to your sitemap in the editor. That's irrelevant for this. These pages are always visible. So I can see every page on a Bubble app. Now, in quite a few apps that I've audited manually, what we see is someone making a page like admin 0654324. And they think that, well, because the name's pretty random, no one's going to stumble across it. Unfortunately, that's misinformed, because you can just list out every single page and use that to find vulnerabilities. Yeah. So we're going to look at some more actionable stuff that you can put into your Bubble apps now. The first is over privacy rules. So privacy rules are the first line of defense against your Bubble app. And I cannot say this any more clearly, but privacy rules are the only thing that protect your data in Bubble. No matter what search constraints you have, or what kind of where you're displaying data or anything, privacy rules are the only thing that will restrict data access in Bubble. Even if you are not placing a search on a page, even if you're not enabling a data API, it is still possible for a technical user to search your app using any constraints that they want, basically see whatever data they want access to. So for that reason, I think it's always a good idea to set them up before building your app. So I assume that the first thing that everyone does is build their database structure. So going through adding all of the data types and all of the fields. As soon as you've done that, you should configure the privacy rules. I know that some people like to do it after they've built an app, but I think that's very silly, because it's just a pain for debugging. Because after you built the app, when you enable privacy rules, you're going to find bugs. It's no way around it. None of us are perfect. It would drive me insane to do that. And add privacy rules first, because it just saves that whole hassle and ensures that it is impossible for any data to be accessed that they should not have access to. This next bullet point here is it's an interesting one. It's one that people don't really think about. So suppose we have a data type called file, and we attach those to a company in Bubble. A normal privacy rule might look like this file's company is current user's company. And in theory, that should restrict that data to basically the current user's company's files. Seems pretty fine. And when everything's going right, it probably would be fine. But I don't think that this privacy rule is sufficient, because what happens, for example, if you delete the company and you forget to delete a file, or perhaps there's an error on Bubble's side which prevents a file being deleted, then what you have is this file's company the company being empty because it's now deleted is current user's company. Now, current user's company might be never empty when the user's logged in, but any logged out user probably has an empty company field. So when this file's company, which is empty, is current user's company, which is empty, then any logged out user will be able to see this data. So essentially, it's very easy to slip up, forget to delete a file when you delete a company, and then essentially all of those files become public because the company field becomes empty and it becomes accessible to any user whose company is empty. The easy way around that is adding an and condition where and this file's company is not empty, or and current user's company is not empty. So it's pretty straightforward. The other thing that we can do is have a test page to display an unconstrained search. I don't do this regularly in apps unless I want to particularly test something. But what you can do is just load up any test page in your app and then put a repeating group down and do a search for the data type you want to test. And then you can just view all of the results. You can log in as any user role and see what they can see. And if you're not happy with some of the data that's being displayed there, you think they shouldn't have access, then you know that you need to tighten that privacy rule, which makes it a lot easier. I'm just going to check the chat. Am I on X? Oh, I'm not, I'm afraid. You probably wouldn't want to hear me anyway. But I'm not on X. You can normally find me on the Bubble forum. When I'm not building apps myself, I'm generally telling people that, yes, you can build that app on Bubble. Yeah. The next thing is plugin security. Now, this is a bit of a tricky one because as developers, we have a responsibility for everything we produce. We have less of a responsibility for things that we don't produce. But when we kind of install a plugin onto our clients' apps, it's very important that you know roughly how that plugin works, or at least do some due diligence to make sure that the thing that you're using on your app is secure. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips that you can use to work that out. Any element, whether it's a plugin or not, that you have on the page, on an element, or in a workflow, is accessible to the end user. So for example, if I place an element on the page and plug an element, let's say, and it has a property for the API key, that's public to the user. It's accessible in the dynamic.js file of the Bubble app. And essentially, they can just do a quick search to find the relevant API key. The only way to upload API keys securely in your app is through the plugins tab, where you can add it in the plugin settings, through the API connector when you check it as private, or in backend using data types, so long as privacy rules restricted appropriately. Now, this isn't a rare issue by any means. It's not just something that I say, it's probably good to think about. The most popular AWS file uploader plugin exposes the API keys for the AWS bucket that you've given it access to. So essentially, they can create files, they can read them, they can edit them, and they can actually just delete them all in one go. So it's really important to use a trusted plugin developer and to know the warning signs. If you're putting something on the page, the user can see it. Let's just check any questions now. No. Okay, that's fantastic. API workflow authentication. So you can take a look at this API workflow that I've added here. Let's just delete all users. It's public by default. I've forgotten to disable that. But fortunately, I haven't enabled this workflow can be run without authentication. So it's never going to happen, right? That's not right. So essentially, this workflow can be run without authentication. That's this checkbox here. It's pretty much irrelevant. What you might think it means is, oh, I need an admin API key, or I need to do it from schedule API workflow. That's not the case. You are able to call any public backend workflow, whether it requires authentication or not, as long as you are logged in. What we mean by authentication is the user has an authentication token, which the user can get by logging in. So as a user, if I'm logged in, I can go into Postman and I can set up this API call to delete all users, and I can make the call to this API, and I will be able to run it. There's no other thing that's stopping me doing that. The only thing that's preventing the damage for this is the privacy rules. I obviously haven't chosen ignore privacy rules, so when I do call the workflow, the data that is deleted is going to be limited to the data that I have permission to see. But let's think about this from like a real app perspective. Take the Bubble official app, for example. Let's load up Bubble's user data type because they have that public by the data API. These are the users that I have access to. I'm logged into Bubble right now. I can see my user, pretty straightforward. I can see also lots of other users. Why can I see these users? Because they're bootcamp instructors and Bubble makes those public. So if Bubble did have a workflow like delete all users, and even if it didn't require authentication, it would be very trivial to make this call, and it would delete all of the users that I have access to here. Just a point on this kind of Bubble user type. There's a particularly interesting field which maybe Bubble can shed light on later. Bad guy Boolean. It sounds like a kind of computer science wrapper. I'm curious to know what it's used for. I'm glad I'm not a bad guy, but take a poke around, see what you can find, because it's pretty interesting what you can see. So suppose that we need to make an API workflow public for whatever reason, but we don't want anyone to be able to call it. We only want it to be called when perhaps we do it in the front end, and we want the user to have permission to call it. What you can do is you can authenticate it within the workflow. So what we can do is when we want to call this workflow from the front end, for example, we can have a permission token data type. When we want to call, let's let someone in. When we want to call this workflow, what we can do is create a new permission token. In actual terms, that's a data type with a field for a random string and maybe an expiry date. And then once we've done that, we can pass the permission token to this API workflow in a text parameter. When we're inside the API workflow, we can search for that permission token and make sure that that permission token exists, i.e. that we within the app have created a permission token and the user is permitted to do this. Now I know what you're thinking. Stripe does not allow us to run workflows with authentication natively, and it has to be public. That means that when you have a webhook, it's very easy for someone to fake a payment. Again, the consequences for software as a service apps, fairly trivial. It's limited to loss of revenue by people wanting to bypass your billing systems. However, in a marketplace app that uses Stripe Express, that could be more dangerous because it could do things that you don't want it to. Basically, every app that I've seen that uses Stripe forgets this, so we're able to kind of offer some quick solutions for it. There's a few solutions. I'll tell you which ones I prefer. The first is the simplest, and it's appending API token to the webhook URL. So anytime you append an API token, that is the API token that you can generate in Bubble from the API settings, you can make it bypass the authentication. So you can ensure that the endpoint requires authentication. But like I said before, as long as the user is logged in, they can still be counted as authenticated. So I don't like this. And also adding your API token as plain text in Stripe, probably not a good idea, because if Stripe has a data breach, you'll find it, the consequences will be pretty difficult because anyone will have your API token. The solution that I like to use is using the Stripe check event endpoint. So you'll know that when you receive a webhook, that's essentially an event in Stripe. Whenever an event happens, it can optionally send a webhook to your app. What we can do is when we receive the webhook, we also receive the event ID. So we can just make an API call back to Stripe and fetch that event ID. And we know that if that event ID exists, then it's a valid request that's come from Stripe. And if it doesn't exist, then we know to terminate the workflow because it's not actually from Stripe. The event ID is never shown to the end user, to the client. So it's a pretty decent way to do so. But you can also make it even more secure by when you receive a webhook, you can request the data that the webhook is sending you back from Stripe. So even if a user sends you some fake data through Postman or whatever, you can make a call to Stripe, get the data they're trying to send you. And if it doesn't show up in Stripe, the request is fake. So some actionable advice. What can you actually do to improve your app security? Pretty straightforwardly. Firstly, obfuscation is never secure. Particularly with Bubble, as I've shown you, you can access a lot of information in Bubble. The second thing is disable the Swagger file. You may not actually know what it does, but basically it provides API documentation to your public backend workflows. Why it's enabled by default, I'm not exactly sure. There's no reason for any Bubble app to have a Swagger file being public. So disable that. You can do that in your API settings. Where necessary, authenticate the backend workflows within the workflow. So that's what I spoke about with doing something like creating a permission token, just to make sure that the request came from Bubble and Bubble's own logic, rather than someone kind of mimicking the request in an external platform. in terms of privacy rules, put them in straight away after building a database structure. It makes life so much easier. If you're not doing it already, you'll not regret doing so. Next thing is verifying that the plugins you're using are secure. Any data that you put on the page or in workflows is public. The final thing, Stripe webhooks cannot be unauthenticated. Like if it's a software as a service app and you can't be bothered and it's your own product and the client's aware, like fine, your loss, I guess. But particularly if you're running a marketplace with connected accounts, it's essential that Stripe webhooks have appropriate authentication. That's all that I have. I will open it up to any questions if you have any. I'll go through the ones that are in chat first. Let me stop sharing my screen. I'll enable mics and cameras. If anyone misbehaves, we'll turn them straight off. But if you have a question, once I've gone through the questions in the chat, we'll open it up. I don't know how many there'll be, and I may not be able to answer them. So if auth is unchecked, you cannot run the workflow, right? You can run the workflow if auth is unchecked. All authentication means is you have to be either logged in or using a admin API token. So for example, when I go to Bubble, if I go to my application, I can't find it. Where is it? Here, I can find my Bubble login cookie here, and I can copy that. That basically is my authentication. And then when I send my request to the Bubble API through something like Postman, I can include the cookie from here, which says that I'm logged in. And that would say, well, it's George making this request. Let's authenticate it. Even though it requires authentication, this user is logged in, so they are authenticated. So that's how that's approached. API token is a security breach. No, it's not a security breach. I wouldn't recommend it. What we mean by that is if you have a webhook URL like yourapp.bubblelapps.io, let's call it checkout completed. What you can do is, oh, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. Maybe that will help. One moment. If you look in my address bar, got my API token here. This is what the webhook URL would look like. And essentially that tells Stripe you can run this workflow and you can run it as an admin user bypassing all privacy rules. The only thing is, if you're putting this webhook URL in Stripe, then of course, if Stripe gets breached, then it's likely that these webhook URLs are stored in plain text. It's not like passwords where if Stripe got hacked, your passwords would be public because passwords aren't stored in plain text. With this, the webhook URL is probably stored in plain text, and so would your API token. So that's why I probably wouldn't do that. Any other plugins except the AWS one you mentioned that you've seen are unsafe? The Wasabi plugin is another one, quite popular at the moment. But these plugins have 3,000 installs between them. Some plugin developers will be responsive to fixing the issues, others less so. Those are the two that I think off of the top of my head. There are probably a lot of others. Lots of the ChatGPT OpenAI plugins have this issue. They put their API token in the front end. Some are public about it. Some don't really tell you and expect you to work it out for yourself. So you just need to be aware of that. If you're using an API token, it should be in the plugin settings. If not, it's a red flag. Check with the plugin author. There may be some other stuff that's going on. If they're using additional actions to get things like a signed URL, just ask the plugin author. But just keep that in your mind. Was this my own private initiative or in collab with Bubble? This was my own private initiative. I originally started doing app audits, but essentially I was frustrated because I did so many audits where the product that someone had spent a lot of money on, and usually it's an individual founder who doesn't have riches, an agency would deliver it and it wouldn't have any privacy rules. Maybe the editor would be public, the API keys wouldn't be secure. So I wanted to actually see, just based on one measure, how widespread the issue is with kind of agency or professional security quality. Because once we establish that, we can actually work to improve it by educating the community with this. Any agencies which had a large number of public apps or a high proportion of public apps, I contacted directly. And the interesting thing is that different agencies responded differently, which influenced how I perceive them. So, for example, one gold agency, we told them that a very large number of their apps were public. And they responded and they accepted responsibility, and they said, we'll review the processes and work out how it happened, which I think is as good of a response as you can expect. But then we contact some other agencies and they insist, oh, it must be a bubble bug. These apps are not public. Even when I send them the direct editor URL, where they're still a collaborator on that app, which I think there's two kind of aspects to security. Whereas professionals, it's important that you both know what you're doing and that you care about what you're doing, because oftentimes, like with agencies, it's easy to have only a little bit of one or have neither. It's really essential that you have both of those. You need to know how to implement security effectively, and you need to know that it's really important. Because I've had to tell so many clients, like in the last couple of weeks particularly, that their app is essentially a sunk cost, because of the quality of what's been produced. Apps that involve children's data being delivered without privacy rules, an agency refusing to fix them because they're not in the project scope. Like, I think we can do better than that, as Bubble. And I think that it's really important for the Bubble ecosystem that we can make sure that we all do a good job, and keep the platform's reputation intact. Because unfortunately, whilst I did audit 18,000 apps, it's unlikely that I was the first to do that. We don't know it, obviously, but I'm sure some malicious actor has probably gone and done that and got whatever data they wanted to get. The only way that we're able to tackle it is by improving it ourselves. Now, there's an interesting aspect which is about Bubble's responsibility with this. So Bubble is the platform. Bubble is not responsible for what you create with Bubble. Bubble has to provide you the tools to do so, but security is ultimately your responsibility. I sent the results to Bubble, as well as some kind of what I thought were common sense suggestions. So things like, if the editor is public, it should be made private automatically after 7 days, or you should get regular emails reminding you of the fact, or live apps shouldn't have public editors at all, because is there really a use for that, except if it's on a template, in which case it's on the template plan. Like, it's common sense stuff like that, which benefits not only the clients, it benefits the agencies because it allows them to ensure they're delivering more secure apps, and it benefits the entire platform because non-agency users benefit from it. So I had a good chat with Bubble about it, and what might be done to improve quality and security and things that professional developers build. But the first step is doing that ourselves and making sure that we understand exactly what's going on. Second part of your question, that was an awfully long answer. I apologize, Andy. Is this your focus, Bubble security like Flask? No, it's not a strict focus. So essentially, we build apps for a fixed price, and we work on existing apps. We're not able to work on all existing apps because we can only work on apps where there isn't heavy technical debt. But we also do $1 app audits. It's a great way to meet new clients, and also just do something positive for the community. We get clients that have just had an app delivered by an agency or a freelancer, and we're able to audit it, and they can send that audit to the agency or freelancer. Because if you're a client, and the thing you've all got to keep in mind is you have a lot of responsibility, because as a developer, it's unlikely that your client understands their app. Like, as a client, you have no way to audit your own app. As long as when you click, it does what you would expect, that's the client. That's all that matters to the client. The client doesn't know if all of your data is public, right? So fundamentally, you just have to be honest and do the right thing, which is to make your app secure, because ultimately it will come back to bite. Like, there's obviously significant legal ramifications. Fundamentally, particularly for a large agency, I think if they're delivering apps without privacy rules, like, it is fundamentally negligent. And I think they're putting themselves in a tricky business position, because if that gets public, then they'll get sued for a lot of money. So everything that you build really needs to be secure. Did I say $1 app audit? Yes, I did. The $1 is a spam filter. I would make it free if I could, but if they're not willing to stump up $1 for that, then they're probably not going to take much consideration into the results that I give them. How many apps sent to you are from agencies as a percent? Of the apps that I audited of 18,000, about 2,000 were built by agencies. For audits, I would say about 40–50% of them are built by agencies or freelancers. I reckon that's just because people that have already worked with an agency or freelancer are more likely to work with another agency or freelancer. So that's what I'd say on that. I hope that all makes sense. Are there any more questions or comments, or like if you have any other actionable tips that you think other people would benefit from hearing, please do speak up. Do I feel agency apps are high quality than freelancer apps? Oh, it depends. It really depends on the freelancer. If I got handed an app and one of them was by a freelancer, one of them was by an agency, I would say that smaller agencies are better. Maybe I'm biased. I don't think that larger agencies do a good job per dollar. I think that fundamentally they work differently, and there's less of a sense of individual responsibility when you work for an agency. When you're a small size like myself, or many of you will be freelancers or small agency employees or owners, you fundamentally work close with the client and treat them very well, because it's a personal thing for you. Whereas when you work for in a large agency, I feel like it's unavoidable that your clients become more like numbers, and you're less attentive to the details. It's more about charging as much money as you can for doing the least amount of work possible. And of course, like there's so many great agencies. It's obviously a few bad apples, I suppose, that would not do such a thing. But the only thing that we need to worry about as professional developers is doing the best job that we can and taking the responsibility to do it ourselves. Whatever the other agencies do, that's on them. The best thing that you can do for your clients is to do an honest job, educate yourself around security, and make sure that you're able to implement that into your app. Are there any other questions? What do I think Bubble needs to give developers? Reassurance that the plugins on the marketplace are secure. I do think Bubble needs to take a moderately more active role in moderating both the agency and the marketplace. Bubble is not like Bubble can't stand in the middle of clients and agencies and act as a mediator when a client has an issue. Like WordPress isn't responsible for the content that WordPress agencies produce, right? But I think that changes when Bubble implemented agency tiers and effectively ranks agencies by gold, silver, bronze, because that does, like whether you like it or not, amount to endorsement. And at that point, you have to have some due diligence over which agencies are getting those awards, especially when it's just based on size. Like however you market it, agencies tiers are based on size, right? It's based on total revenue contributed to Bubble. In terms of the plugin market space specifically, I think that also needs to have a more active role. I reported plugins with public API tokens to Bubble, that it wasn't documented that it was public. And they said, yeah, sorry, not much we can do, which I think is a shame, because if 2,000 apps having their AWS keys public isn't a big enough issue for Bubble to intervene, then I don't really know what would be. Obviously, Bubble's policies are Bubble's policies, but if it was me, I would probably change how I approach that. Any other things regarding plugin security that we should look out for? Malicious code is obviously one. I don't think it's a widespread problem in Bubble. I haven't encountered an app that does it. By malicious code, I mean something that someone's putting in not to help your plugin, but to help them, whether it's malware or something else. I don't think it's widespread at all. The one thing you do need to be aware of is tracking. Lots of plugins in the past would say they don't track, and they actually track their users for their own analytics. Bubble made the change recently to the plugin marketplace to require that to be declared, which is a very good thing. But that should all be now pretty public and easy to work out, because Bubble does check whether an app is collecting data or not. Anything else? One tip is to hide an API connector to the URL. Yep, you can do that. Anything that you mark as private in the API connector, is private, hidden from the user. Generally speaking, probably not an issue if your API endpoint URL is public, but it depends on what you're using, and hiding it more is always better, even though it's not security in itself. Is the declaration automatic, or does it tell the plugin devs to declare it? The plugin developers declare it. I think recently they had to relist all of their plugins and answer whether it was collecting user data, tracking user data or not. Just wait a sec, see if any more come in. Otherwise, I'll call it there. Awesome. Well, I hope it's been helpful for you. What I'll do is I'll link my Bubble forum profile in the chat. If you go to the top topics that I've made, lots of them are about security, and you may find it helpful to go through and basically see a lot of what I've said in writing. I know I speak pretty quickly. We went through a lot of information in a short amount of time, but if I did my job, then you should have a pretty good idea of Like, even if you knew some stuff, there should be a couple of things that you can actively pick up and start doing in your future apps and implementing in any existing apps that you've built. So I hope it's helpful, and it's been great to speak to all of you. Have a great day, and thanks, Tass, for recording that as well. I'm sure you can liaise with Sarah to upload that.